of local and international organizations concerned with neuropsychopharmacology, both basic research and applications of that research. He is an award-winning teacher at Vanderbilt and an outstandingly recognized researcher. He is also a frequent consultant to academic, governmental, professional, industrial organizations, and so forth. He's author of several books. His most recent book is in its 9th edition, the well-known book, Drugs, Society, and Human Behavior, published by McGraw-Hill. So please welcome Professor Oakley Ray.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction. I started with a couple of slides that I want to take some people back, particularly if you notice who the head person is here. This is about 30 years ago. Mike Hodges was doing this program, and I had just arrived at Vanderbilt in 1970, and this shows you the kind of thing we were doing back then. And I know John Knox is here someplace. And I really did talk about physiological psychology here. Dick Lanton said, "Okay, you're a physiological psychologist, you do it." He was a historian, and we were on. But then, as always, you know, here's John Knox at the end. In case you don't know, John Knox, of course, is the #1 professor on campus at Vanderbilt. So I'm really pleased that he's agreed to comment on what I have to say, although I'm not sure what the relevance is of what I have to say to philosophy. You know, today's talk is not going to be cutting-edge research. It's much better. It's cutting-edge concepts. What I'm going to do is try to stretch your brain, because, you know, the brain is not elastic. Once you stretch it, it stays stretched and gets ready to grow even more. What I'm going to do is talk about the power of the mind. This is not mind as something that's sitting up here 6 inches above the top of your head. This is mind as the operation of the brain. Mind in every shape and form that you can think of has to do with how do we get certain things done. We know about the power of the mind. You know about the placebo. Placebos work in about 35% of the times it's given, whether it's an operation or a pill. It works as well as the real operation or the real pill. It may fade away after about 6 months, but in some cancer studies, placebos even cause hair to drop out. Well, you also know about the power of the mind and the way in which hypnotism works to control pain and discomfort. So what I want you to do is realize that you already know a lot about the power of the mind. What I'm going to do is give you some examples and a framework into which you can put this power of the mind to understand the impact that it has on us today, and for the next several years, it's going to have a major impact. I think most of you are familiar with John Milton. The mind is its own place in itself to make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. And I think this is certainly a very true statement. Robert Ader was a researcher who, back in the 1970s, was the first person to show that it was possible to condition, the same way Pavlov conditioned the dog to salivate to a bell. He showed you could condition the immune system. So he's a very important person. Now, later on, what he did was show how you suppress the immune system through classical conditioning. Later on, some people showed about 10 years later how you can enhance the immune system through classical conditioning. But he said there's been a huge transformation in the way we view the relationship between our mind and good health, our mind and disease in many ways. It is nothing short of a revolution. What I want to do is tell you about this revolution, because I think it is a revolution, and we need to spread the word as much as we can. Healthcare models, which is what many of the groups that I talk to are involved with, in the past, the purpose of healthcare with the focus was on fighting sickness. Now it's on building health. The emphasis used to be on environmental factors. Now it's on behavioral factors. It used to be the cause of diseases of pathogen. Now it's the interaction between the host and the pathogen. And on and on and on. The role of the patient is now much more important than it ever was. When I was a small child, you got sick, the doctor came in and did things to you, and he or she, no, it's always a he, although My personal physician was Dr. Mackey. She lived right across the street from us. She was the one who made you healthy. You didn't have anything to do with it. They did things to you and you got better. We don't believe that anymore. So the physician's role is very different now from what it was before. Well, with that as an introduction, I want to introduce you to the science of psycho-endo-neuroimmunology. And you have to say it before we leave you out of the room, so you better practice it now. Psycho-endo-neuroimmunology. I call it PENI for short, P-E-N-I. This is the new science that integrates the mind with the body. So the science of psycho-endo-neuroimmunology is, the title of this is How the Mind Hurts and Heals the Body. And I'm going to go through and do this. I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm going to give you representative studies. I'm not going to give you a lot of hard data. I could go and give this to your PTA group and they would say, golly gee, they would understand it. So we're not going to get into hard science. The multiple factors which determine infection. Now you may not appreciate, if you're not in the healthcare area, that there are two different things. One is becoming infected, and that means that the viruses, the bacteria are replicating themselves in your body. And then there's the illness. These are the symptoms. And you can be infected without having the illness. So you need to understand that this is an important thing. And one of the things that contribute to whether or not you become infected, your predisposing genes, your personality and beliefs, things in the psyche, your lifestyle, which is the interaction of your psyche with the behavior in the environment. The environment, of course, you know about the pathogen. There's some things in which you don't really have a pathogen, like in heart disease, the whole atherosclerosis. Maybe there's not a pathogen, they're not really sure yet, but if you don't want that, just talk about cholesterol, but it's the proximal cause that's a critical thing. That may not be a pathogen. But once you have the individual infection, then you have the same things again, and some people end up ill. But I want you to understand that anywhere between 1 to maybe 20% of the people who become infected also develop the illness. So just the fact that you're infected does not mean that you become ill. And so we're going to talk about some of those variables as we move on. Well, these are the three systems that you probably know very well about in the psycho-endo-neuroimmunology. On the left side there, you can see the endocrine system outlined in vague form. The central part is, of course, the nervous system. And then on the right is the lymph system, which is where much of the immunology seems to take care of itself. And then the next slide shows you the psyche. It's really my picture of the psyche. It's horrible. You know, they just always want to go back. Let's go back and we'll talk about someone who's one of my favorite people, Hippocrates. It'll take me about 30 seconds to tell you, he said lots of good things. But the thing I want you to remember is that he said, it's more important to know the patient who has the illness than it is to know the illness that the patient has. Now, he said that many years ago, and one of the reasons why he had to say that is because, of course, he had no way of dealing with any of the diseases appropriately, so he had to deal with the patient. We come back to that now. Now we have to focus on the patient if you really want to heal somebody. Very soon after him, Galen. Now, I don't think he wore a top hat back around, you know, the Roman times, but that's how they thought a medieval woodcut he looked like. He made an interesting comment. He said, only about 20% of the people who come into my office, he was a physician, only about 20% of the people who come in have something physically wrong with them. Mostly it's emotional, psychological things. Well, nobody thought too much about that until back in 1991, they published a study in which they surveyed about 1,600 people who came into an outpatient medical clinic. And at the end of the time, they said, you know, only 11% of the people who appeared at that clinic for health care had something physically wrong. Patients don't change. Symptoms don't change. People don't change. That's the important thing. People don't change. A lot of other things do, but people don't. Well, we all know about Rene Descartes. Great man. He had one thing that was important for us. He was the one who convinced the Catholic Church, which meant he convinced the whole world, that the body and the soul of the mind were two separate things. And as a result, it was all right to study the body without mucking up the soul. And after that, the whole biomedical revolution took off. One of the stars in the biomedical revolution was Louis Pasteur, the man who invented milk. Well, he did a few other things too. He also was an advocate of the germ theory of disease. What he did was suggest that if you have a germ, you're going to have the disease, you're going to have the illness. One of his contemporaries, who's not nearly as well known but should be, Claude Bernard, is the fellow who focused on the internal milieu. He said, no, it's not true. You got to worry about the environment that hosts the internal milieu as well as the pathogen. Well, I grew up on a farm, and if you grew up on a farm, you know that seed is not enough. You got to have a receptive soil, and that's what he was pushing for, and that's what we're moving back toward now as we go along. Leading causes of death. Back in 1860, when I was born, that's the kind of thing that died of. And then John Locke came along in 1900, and that's what people died of. But now when Mike Hodges was born in the year 2000, that's what people died from. I want you to pay attention not to how we look at these various ages, but what we die of now. All the things in the right-hand column, these are diseases of lifestyle. Diseases of lifestyle. And this is why, you notice it's very hard to find very much over here in the right-hand column that speaks to an external pathogen. Now there's some there, pneumonia obviously comes along, your influenza, we're not sure about Alzheimer's disease, but most of the things in the right-hand column are diseases of lifestyle, how we live. And this is why it becomes even more important for those of us who are in the healthcare area to focus on the patient and the variables that we talked about. But there's other reasons as to why we should all be concerned too. Follow the standard death rate for 9 common infections. This is kind of an interesting slide. This is the incidence of each one of these illnesses over the years from 1900 up to about 1973. And what you see is that the decrease in the incidence of the illness fell off long before the biomedical intervention occurred. What does that tell you? It tells you something was happening in the world. Well, a couple of things were happening in the world. One of the things, if you go back and read the historians who were writing around 1900, they said, there was a whole air of optimism. People were beginning to look forward to a brand new world. The year 1900, the millennium change of the thing, people saw that as kind of a change of the century. It's a major impact. Well, not only that, but one of the better historians who looked at this, Leonard Sagan, let me read it with you. The history of rapid health gains in the United States is not unique. The rate at which death rates have fallen is even more rapid in more recently modernized countries. The usual explanation for this dramatic improvement, better medical care, nutrition, or clean water, provide only partial answers. More important is the rise of hope and the decline of despair and hopelessness. Well, when I talk to a clinical group, I say it 3 or 4 times, that very last sentence. More important is the rise of hope and the decline of despair and hopelessness. If you look at the literature, it's very clear. People who look at a glass and see it, it's filled to the midline, the same kind of thing you've done with all your children and grandchildren or whatever. Filled to the midline. Is it full, half full, is it half empty? If you see it as half full, that predicts lower incidence of heart disease. If you see it as being, half empty, a pessimistic sort of thing, that predicts an increase in the mortality from heart disease. So these are not things of the mind, of course, these attitudes. We'll come back to that in a minute. But these are important determinants of our health. So if you really want to do something, I was down in Paraguay talking to a group. And I said, look, I told this to every quasi-developed country. I said, do not spend your time trying to bring in modern, and I shouldn't say that with Dewey here, who goes out in the good ship Hope and does all kinds of good things as a physician. If you really want to do things for these people, don't spend a lot of money on health care. Spend it on education. Spend it on hope. Spend it on what goes on up here. And then all the other things are going to come along. But we'll come back and talk about that later on, I hope. Well, stress is a many splendored thing. It really is, and some of you are old enough to remember the movie that I stole that from. Let me give you the Oakley Ray comprehensive way of looking at stress. I put a formula at the top, so I might fool some of you to think this is a scientific talk. I can tell some of you are already deluded. WB, psychological well-being, equals knowledge, information about the world and how it operates. Just the more knowledge, one of the best health habits a person can have is more education. I'll show you a slide, as you go from hardly any education to more education, death rate goes down. Inner resources, techniques we have learned to determine our perception of the world and how it works. This is not knowledge. How do you see the world? Do you see the glass half full or half empty? The kinds of things John and I were talking about before, the Marty Seligman explanatory style. How do you explain things? Is it out there or is it you? Value and the defense mechanisms are the same thing. Social support, interpersonal systems we've developed and participated in. Spirituality, beliefs we have about purpose, order, and morality. Beliefs about a higher power. 30 years ago, who would have ever walked into a psychology class that wasn't the psychology of religion and never talked about spirituality or religion? Where would you have found it anywhere in the journals? Nowhere. Now, you cannot open a journal without having something in there about religion, religious activity, beliefs, spirituality, what have you. People are getting to do studies now. And now they're getting to show that there's something. There's a lot of flaky things out there, I know. And I personally do not believe that somebody can go off and pray in a corner and have an effect on somebody over here. And I come from almost quite a primitive Baptist background. You know, and so, but I come to this kind of thing. You really want to see the power of belief up here. If you read what the curator, the medical director at Lourdes says, he says, you know, we're seeing fewer and fewer miracles as modern science moves in. But to me, the real miracle is the power of the mind and the impact that that has on our health and our well-being. And finally, of course, you have to worry about the life demands, the physical and psychological demands that we face. Some have a lot, they're very complicated, some have not so many. Well, I want to talk about the educational level and death rates. Look at this. The reason the females in this very lower group is because of the death because of childbirth. But notice what happens. The more education you have, the mortality rates go down. So every bit of schooling that you get is a healthy thing for you. And so when you worry about, should you spend money on your children to go to college or do this or do that, at least you keep them alive longer. Let me tell you about this study. It's really kind of neat. They took elderly men, all men, over the ages, most of them over the ages, not necessarily. And they were getting bypass operation. They asked them a whole bunch of questions. One of the things they did before the operation was they asked them if they got any strength and comfort from their religious beliefs. Some people said yes, some people said no. Another one of the things they asked is, how much support do you get from your social group? And they measure social group in, your family, your friends, relatives, people in the community. Well, what happens? If they didn't participate in any group, and they didn't get any comfort or strength from what they believed, you get a mortality rate within 6 months after surgery of almost 25%. But if you both have a social support system, and you got comfort and strength from your religion, the mortality rate is about 4%. 6-fold change. And what is it? Power of the mind. It's the belief system. Now, it turns out that the most important thing in determining whether or not people die in this 6 months is whether or not they had ever had an operation before. Was this a second bypass operation? That's the most important thing. The next thing that was most important was were they over the age of 70? But number 3 was group participation. Number 5 was religious in terms of predicting mortality. So these are not ephemeral things. These are real hard data that speak to a lot of the issues we're concerned about. Well, I try to put all this together in a diagram that makes sense to me. I group all the coping skills together. I don't care whether it's knowledge, inner resources, social support, spirituality. I just lump them all down into coping skills. And I just put all the life demands on the other side, on the y-axis. But let me tell you this too. The life demands are not really demands out there. The life demands are how you see things up here. You all know situations in which somebody says, my God, how can I ever get this done? It's horrible. And other people say, it's a big challenge. Same situation, same abilities. And other people, they don't even notice it. The problem is not out there. It's how you see it out there. Hans Selye said it many, many years ago. He says, you know, it's not what's out in the environment, it's how you take what's out in the environment that's a critical variable. Well, when your coping skills match the demands of your life, this is why many of you are here, because you weren't happy with what you had when you had a 6th grade education, 12th grade education. You're too bright. You had too much you wanted to do. And so you keep going until finally you hit some place where at least the challenges are equal to your ability. And some of you became college professors, and some of you decided that wasn't enough for you. You got up and became CEOs of large companies, and on and on and on. The important thing is we try to find something so we end up on this midline where we're happy, we're satisfied, we have good feelings about ourselves and about the world. That's what happens when the demands in somebody's life are greater than the coping skills. Well, the first, what you do, and you've all done this, you hustle. You move a little bit fast. You study a little bit more than the other people do. You hustle. And pretty soon, you can't keep up no matter how hard you hustle. You begin to worry. And not only do you worry, but you worry a little bit more. You worry about, am I really good enough? Can I compete with all these people? Am I worthy? And the only way to deal with these demands that you don't have the skills for is you begin to withdraw. And as you withdraw not only from the demands, but also from the rewards of the environment. And this is what we talk about many times, is clinical depression. On the other side, though, much more familiar to many of you, I'm sure, you have many more abilities than the challenges. And so you begin to loaf. And pretty soon, you get bored. And then you get into existential angst. You know, is this all there is to life? It's so easy. It's a piece of cake. It's dumb. And pretty soon you begin to get mad about it because it is so dumb. And then pretty soon you begin to act out. And this is one of the things that you have to worry about. So we try to put all of this together into this particular framework. The next slide gives us some of the physiology that fits in. Now, one of the very important ways that we monitor what goes on in the body is with a system called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortex system. And this is a schematic for it. The hypothalamus, which is sitting up there right above the roof of your mouth, if you really want to know where it is, it produces corticotropic releasing hormone. That moves about ½ an inch in a very special blood supply down into the pituitary. The pituitary produces ACTH, which you know about, and that flows all through the body. Has a lot of effects. The effect we're concerned about is it goes to the adrenal cortex, right up here in the adrenals at the top of your kidneys, and it says produce cortisol. Now cortisol does an awful lot of good things all over the body, but does one thing that we want to know about here. Cortisol is the most potent anti-natural killer cell product of the body. Now, the natural killer cells are part of the immune system, very important for it. What they do is drift around through the body, and unlike many other parts of the immune system, when they bump into a cancer cell, they go, shoot! And they try to kill it. They don't need somebody to come in and say, oh, that's a cancer cell, which is what happens in many parts of the immune system. And so what happens is, the cortisol, now, this is homeostasis, this is the old system. Cortisol goes back, acts on the hippocampus in the brain. Hippocampus inhibits the hypothalamus, and this is a nice self-regulating system. Nice self-regulating system. When the cortisol level goes up, the CRH level goes down. When the CRH level goes down, cortisol goes down, and it's sort of back and forth in this very narrow thing, like your temperature, like the air conditioner in your house. Under stress in the mind, something happens. What happens is that the cortex, where stress is, inhibits the feedback. And as a result, what you get is an increase in the amount of cortisol that begins to accumulate in the body. And as the amount of cortisol goes up, the ability of the immune system goes down, becomes less effective. And when that happens, the individual and the animals, lots of studies on this, become more susceptible, particularly to cancer growth. And in old age, there's another whole series, but we'll talk about that sometime in the elderly. But the critical thing here is that this is one of the ways in which this whole system works, to regulate and to dysregulate our susceptibility to illness. And this impact on the immune system is a very potent one. Well, let me tell you about a study that I think it's a classic. It's just beautiful study. It's the kind of thing you wish you had all done if you were a researcher. Sheldon Cohen did it at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And what he did was take young adult volunteers, puts them in isolation for 3 days, monitors them to see if they're developing any kind of an upper respiratory illness, a common cold, that kind of thing. And after 3 days, if they're not showing any symptoms, he takes 1 of 5 viruses plus a placebo in different individuals, blows them up the nose to see if he can infect them. And then they monitor are the viruses replicating over the next 4, 5, 6 days. And what they find is that, yes, they do in many people, some they don't. We'll see about that in a minute. But then they find some people also develop the illness. So 2 things now. Remember, we talked about this before. One is the infection, and one is the illness. Well, when you have that kind of a situation, how do you tell the illness? Well, you have a physician look at the person. You have the person say, I really feel lousy, and his nose and eyes are running. And then you measure how much mucus on the facial tissues. You weigh them. Well, the study they did also used 3 stress measures done at the beginning of the study before anything happened. One was perceived stress. You ask the person several ways, and this is your summary, the degree in which the individual feels able to cope with the current life demands. The second stress measure, negative affect, the degree in which an individual feels unhappy or anxious about himself or herself. And then finally, stressful life events. These are not things up here, but how many things happen in your life out there? Your wife ran away, your cat got killed, you lost your house. I mean, go on and on and on. Or more relevant to this group, you failed your preliminary exams, your paper got rejected. I mean, all those things, stress is out there. Well, what they did was then begin to look at the relationship between stress measures and the people who became infected from these viruses. And what you find is that as the stress measure goes up, so does the incidence of people who become infected. That means the viruses are growing within the individual. Goes from about 71% up to about 93%. There's a nice relationship between stress and infection. But then you want to ask too, what's the relationship between stress and cold? Now look at first of all, the y-axis, very different numbers here. A lot of people became infected who didn't develop into the cold. But again, there's a good relationship between the amount of stress the person experienced or reported, and in fact, the number of people who came down with colds. We had 3 different stress measures, though. He did another study, and he showed that he can divide perceived stress. This is a median. That's very simple. You divide, you get a ranking, and you divide it into the middle. It's a median split. With a high perceived stress, they had a higher probability of becoming infected than people below the median. Negative affect, those who had high scores, higher probability of infection than those below. With stressful life events, there were no differences in who became infected. The difference with the stressful life events had to do with the symptoms. There weren't any differences up here for perceived stress and negative affect. Down here, though, there are big differences. So I put it into an algorithm, which I think is a very useful thing. You can use it in your own life. Lots of viruses out there floating around. If there are a lot of viruses floating around, then the probability that they're going to come in contact with you is pretty high. If they come in contact with you, what determines whether or not you become infected? In other words, are the viruses going to grow in you? Well, if you're high in perceived stress and negative affect, then you can become infected. But who cares if you're infected or not? The important thing is, when you go out on your date, when you stand in front of a class, you have a cold. And that's going to be determined by how many stressful life events occurred over the past year. It's just an algorithm, nothing more than a decision-making tree to predict the probability of colds developing in some situations. And they have used, not this model, but essentially the same thing. And they've even tied it in in which they monitor medical students, self-report stress. They monitor their immune system. They monitor the incidence of cold. And as you might guess, before exams, stress goes up, the immune system goes down. The probability of a cold, upper respiratory infection goes up. Beautiful study, beautiful study. And it turns out to be exactly what you would predict. Well, getting it out of your system, the talking treatment, this is what psychologists do. I have a elderly friend a physician down in Lewisburg, and he calls me his word doctor. He says, you know, real doctors, MDs, he means, they cure people with pills. Psychologists cure people with words. So I was his word doctor. Well, the big question, of course, is, what can words do? David Spiegel, a psychiatrist out of Stanford, did a study back in the late 80s, which amazed him and astounded him. It's been partially replicated and partially not replicated. We'll get back and talk about that if you want to. But what happened is these are all women with metastatic, that means it's spread, breast cancer. They know they're going to die. They had the operation, the breast was taken off, and back then it was probably a full mastectomy instead of a lumpectomy. And they all underwent radiation treatment. And then they went in standard treatment. You come back, you know, every week or every 2 weeks. One group, the group that's represented in B, they participate in group therapy for 1 year. 90 minutes a week. They come in for 90 minutes a week, they sit around and they talk. And we'll talk about what they talk about. And after that year, then they would treat like everybody else. The other group, they came in for the usual medical exams and medication and radiation, but they didn't get any psychotherapy, group therapy. And what you see is the people who got group therapy lived, on the average, about twice as long. About twice as long. Well, I don't know anybody who thinks that you can cure cancer with words. And I don't know anybody real that is, who thinks you can get cancer by talking about it or being overly worried or overly concerned or overly depressed. But all of these things seem to tie in. And people have done some studies that speak to what the critical thing here is. That's another study. A study done in the UK, and what you found, these were women who, again, had breast cancer. They gave them the best possible treatment. They had their surgery. 3 months after they had their surgery and radiation treatment was done, the physicians went in and said, hey, you've been given a diagnosis of cancer. You've had your breast taken off. You're in treatment. What's your reaction to this? And then they classified all of these blind people who were classified blind into these 5 response systems. The fighting spirit, I know I have cancer, but I'm going to beat it. Denial, I never had cancer. They took on my breast, they treated me, but I never had cancer. Stoic acceptance. Hey, when you have cancer, that's it. It's all over. Anxious judgment. I know I had cancer, but they took on my, I'm afraid it's going to come back again. And again, the helplessness. What can you do? When you have cancer, you do. Look at who lives. Only the first 2 groups live after 15 years. And the critical thing is that if you accept the fact that you have a diagnosis of X, Y, Z, and you say, but it ain't going to kill me, that's a good health habit. Or if you deny that you have it, that's the second best health habit. So denial is not as bad a thing as you might think it is. But what kind of therapy works? Step therapy, without any psychoanalysis, it's a little bit effective, but it's not very good. Behavior therapy is a little bit better. The best, and that's a funny term for it because that's what they used in this 1989 study, creative innovation therapy. Creative innovation therapy is essentially focusing on these 3 principles. Teaching people, women, almost always, because these are all breast cancer, because it's such a, pardon the expression, nice clean disease and illness. Increasing assertiveness. Stand up for yourself. Tell your doctor that you want to know what's going on. That sort of thing. Second thing, increase your self-esteem. Even in that group therapy, I used to run groups at the VA hospital for cancer patients. And a lot of these people were terminal. And if you've never been around one of these things, you kind of don't realize the power that this is. But you're sitting there and you're talking about 15 or 20 other people. Then the next week, somebody isn't there. Somebody says, you know, whatever happened to X, Y, Z? Oh, they died. Then they taught me, no, I remember when he did this. That was so nice of him. And one of the things people learn is, you know, I may not be president of a university, but I'm important to the people in the school. They care about me. And that increases their self-esteem tremendously. Because so many times we don't tell people that we care about them. And if you ever get into any of these kinds of things, how do you deal with your elderly parents? The first thing you should do, of course, you should start when you're this big. You start hugging and kissing your children when they're that big. You should teach them to hug and kiss you at every age. You don't wait until you're in this kind of a situation. But so many times we lose our self-esteem and our self-efficacy, the ability to believe we have an impact on the world. And then, of course, you reduce pain through self-hypnosis. Those are the psychotherapy goals for that creative innovation therapy. And those are the outcomes that you get, too. Interestingly, I used to call this a Solomon strategy for survival, but then I had never talked to Dr. Solomon that I stole it from, but he didn't phrase it quite this way, so I took his name off of it. If you accept the diagnosis, yes, I have cancer. And if you defy and deny the diagnosis, but it ain't going to kill me, you're going to live longer. This is research that comes out of the AIDS period, back before we had any kind of chemotherapy to deal with AIDS. People wonder, how do these people live for 10 years with AIDS? Everyone else is dying in the first 15 months. Here's the answer. These are the people who say, yes, I have AIDS. I have AIDS. Versus, well, I have AIDS, you know, death certificate, boop, they die. You have to understand. And the only difference is what's up here. But see, what's up here, that's why the psycho-endoneuroimmunology is so important. Everything that you think about, remember, your thoughts, your mind, nothing more than the action of the brain. And we don't know that much about how the brain works. Now, we have people out doing all these little nuancey studies that they're fine, and that's fine. I'll give you one thing. If I say to you, or to any neurophysiologist or anybody, if I think to myself, raise your right arm, and I raise my right arm, how does that happen? Don't talk to me about motor cortex and things like that. How does it, from my thoughts, how does it go? We don't know how that happens. I won't. Suppose I say, raise your right arm, and I don't raise it. How does that happen? We don't know. So when people say they worry about things like this, you know, so much we don't know about the brain and the mind. What we're talking about here is how we can use the power of the mind, even as we begin to stumble into this next century and learn what's going on. So let's go to another thing. Good friends mean good health. If you grew up in the kind of home that I'm sure most of you grew up in, your mothers were always telling you good friends mean good health. If I were in charge of the world, and there are a lot of reasons why I'm not, but we'll come back to that later. One of the things everybody would learn in 8th grade, along with all your food groups and everything else, is the best health habit you can have is to have friends. I would teach kids how to make friends and how to keep friends. And these data support it. This is a famous Alameda County study. They followed about 6,000 males and females, county right outside of California. They followed them for 9 years, and they had some very simple questions for our purposes here. At the end of 9 years, are you alive or dead? That's a pretty simple thing. Well, what they find is that the usual thing. If you smoke a lot, those people die sooner. If you're way overweight, those people die sooner. And then when you control for all of those, they ask the question, how many friends, how many acquaintances, how good are your relationships with the people around you? And they looked at friends, relatives, workplace acquaintances, and then they looked at the number of people you do things with in the community. Whether it's a Vanderbilt community, a university community, around in the city, how much interaction do you have? And you can see, the results are pretty clear. A couple things are pretty obvious. One is males die sooner than females. We'll come back and talk about that too if you want to, because I have a theory on why God did that. She had her way about it. Second thing is the older you get, the more likely you are to die. Now, that's the only impressive thing that I see here, because I want it to go the other way, but we'll come back. The critical thing here for this talk about the mind is the fact that the people who had the most connections, the most relationships, they have the lowest mortality, whether they're male or female or whatever age. Good friends do mean good health. And not only that, as you get older, it becomes more important. More important. Because, you know, when you're young, you got a good, healthy immune system. It doesn't care whether you have friends or not. You're going to live no matter what. 30 to 29. You get older, then it becomes important. And look at that difference. I mean, you're going from 5–6% up to 39% just in 30 years. It's important to realize that good friends become more important as you get older. The data are so robust in the literature that some people have recommended that we need to institute governmental policies. I'm serious now. When people begin to get old, you go around and you say, do you have some friends? What do you do? I was up in Stanford, and I was talking about this at development one of the psychiatrists was in. He said, you know, I can't get my patients to get friends written. I said, do you have a prescription pen? She said, yeah. I said, let me see. I said, right down there, see a person every afternoon for 2 hours and give it to them. You write scripts for medicine, why don't you write a script for behavior? Oh, I don't know whether you ever did it or not, because can you charge for a behavioral prescription? You know, because you got to realize that this is real. I'll give you another one. The percentage of patients dead within 10 years after the first heart attack. Now, the type A personality, the kind of person becomes the dean, becomes a departmental chair. You know, they're hostile, they're cynical, they're real SOBs. Those people have a higher mortality rate than people like John Watts and myself, who are the manana, laid back, easy come, easy go kinds of people, not trying to achieve anything at all. Now, these are all socially isolated patients. They have no friends. Well, if they have friends, everybody benefits, but the SOBs benefit even more. Time benefits. There are interactions between these things. And this is powerful. These are powerful things. Now, if I knew the answers to how all of these work, I would not be here, I tell you right now. I'd be sitting home waiting for a phone call from Stockholm. But I don't know these mechanisms. Some of you are maybe going to get involved in learning how to do this, and you become rich and famous, and get a Nobel Prize, because there's going to be one. It's for how the mind does hurt or heal the body. Dying of a broken heart. Well, you've all heard this again from your mother or from your grandmother. See, I'm very much taken with mothers and grandmothers because they know an awful lot. And I used to hand out to my introductory psychology students 2 things. And one of them had to do with the difference between a physicist and a psychologist in trying to determine how long it takes for a ball to roll down a hill. Well, you tell that to a physicist, it's very easy, like lobbing, flying, plane, and blah. This is psychology, though. See, the hill, the ball, first of all, is soft on one side, it's roughed up on another side, it's got some fuzz on another side, and the hill has got swampy places here and there. Now, that's life. I tell people, I said, well, this is not rocket science. It's a lot more difficult. This is psychology. See, and that's the thing that we have a hard time convincing people. Dying of a broken heart. Anybody's heard of that. Well, even the U.S. government agrees with, let's look at these data. First off, this is an early study. Mortality rate increase for widowers in the first 6 months after the death of a wife. All causes, 40%. But cardiovascular, the heart, it breaks in 60% of the time. Well, if that first 6 months is critical, after that, then things go on. This is so powerful. I tell them, my wife is usually in the audience, but she's got a thing to do tonight. And I say, look, when they lay if my wife predeceases me, which is a fancy way of saying dies before I go, if my wife predeceases me, if they lower her into the ground, let me say anything like this, looking around to see who's available, I ain't going to spend that night alone. It's an important thing. My wife has come to accept that, you know. And, you know. But she also says, don't worry, I'm not going to spend that night alone either, but I don't know what she has in mind. The critical thing here, though, is that we have done several studies. This is a classic study. They looked at different ages. These are males, and their wives died. What happens? The amount of pink that you see, or whatever color you want to call that, purple, that tells you how much more likely it is that a widower dies than the same age, same race, same community, same socioeconomic level male whose wife is still alive. And so you can see there's a significant amount of effect between the widowed at the yellow and the married. And so this is for males. When a wife dies, it has a major impact on the husband. They did the same thing with wives when their husbands died. They give a damn whether we're around or not. See, that's real. That's real. See, now, there are studies from other areas suggesting that one of the reasons why, for a man, that's a true statement, one of the best health habits you can have is to get married. Because women are giving, women are supportive. And that's why when a wife dies, that's a bad health omen for guys. Men are not very supportive. They're not very giving. They are not very helpful. And so when a guy dies, no big deal. No big deal. Well, you know, I could go on and agree with them, but it's a real thing. See, I guess I have to get this out of my system. And I talked about, you know, women dying not the same rate as men and all those things. Women are more gyroscopic. I think it has to do with their period, has to do with their hormones, but they are much more regulated internally. Men are much more bebopping out there in the environment. Women are much more stable. And as it was, I don't remember how we started. Here's conception. 3 months after conception, all of a sudden, in some of us with a Y chromosome, we all learn testosterone. In this whole process, it was building a female. Now, it says, whoop, stop. We're not going to turn out a 4-door sedan. Let's make it convertible. They turn out a male. And we're just not as good because we're makeovers, right from the very beginning. And so we can talk about, you know, what happens to all of that. But the critical thing is that these figures I showed you are not made up. This is the relationship between mortality rates. It's a little impact for women who are widowed, but not nearly like it is for men. As a matter of fact, it's about a 5-fold factor between males and females. And we'll come back and talk about it then. The will to live is an important part of staying alive. I think a lot of people began to believe this for the first time when Charles Schulz died on the very day that the last original Peanuts cartoon appeared in the newspaper. I tell the second year medical students when I was allowed to teach them, which I did for many years when they caught on to me, and I said, the only person who doesn't believe in the will to live in a hospital is a second year medical student. I said, the patients, they know about the will to live. Their relatives know about the will to live. The older physicians know about the will to live. The second year medical student is still so taken with biochemistry and it doesn't know about the mind yet that they say, how can the will to live have any impact at all on it? Well, let's see. This is the first study. Relationship between month of birth and month of death in famous men. Now, you got to be famous because if you're not famous, you kind of die anytime, you know, randomly. It doesn't mean anything. Maybe. We'll come back to that too. But these are famous people. How do we know they're famous? Well, they were in who's in America. Or they were buried in Westminster Abbey in London. Pretty famous people. And what you find is that they wait until their birth month before they die. Why? Well, you don't know, but I'm famous. And I'm going to wait till after my birth month because the Queen of England says, hey, Oakley, have another happy birthday. You know, and on and on. Famous people send things. They do good things for you. You know, if you're Joe Schmuck like me, nobody cares. What? He's gone. Oh, well, on it goes. You know, you have to understand. The will to live is the real thing. Real? How do you look at it? Level of fame. Let's look at that. Occurred deaths as a percentage of expected deaths in the 1 month before and in the 3 successive months after in 3 American males. High level of fame. Look at that. Now this is occurred deaths as a percentage. Divided across 12, so 8%. This is way down. 22% of these very famous men. Who are very famous men? How did they determine them? Are they in 2 children's history books in the United States? Very famous men, George Washington. Everybody heard of George Washington? Thomas Edison. Pretty famous guys. Everybody's heard of them. Moderately famous, you know, you get into some moderately kind of people there, and I don't want to go on and give you all of this, but you get out here into this is a John Hancock kind of thing, as a matter of fact. What's interesting is that people out here, now these are moderately famous by these children's books. Tesla was one of the people there. And most people outside of this audience, only I throw it in here is because you probably know about someone like Nicholas, but fame is an important thing. But are there other reasons? So we know now that maybe birthdays are a reason to stay alive for. Now the next question, of course, is are there any other kind of events that might be important to stay alive for? How about something that meant something very much to somebody, very strong emotions? Well, death for the natural cause, an unambiguously Jewish name meant, and you have to phrase it that way because they don't put your religion on a death certificate. And so what they did was go through and they screened them, and if they had, high reliability, then they put them into this category. And when they looked at when did people die, this is for Passover, which is a very important time, and we're right into this period right now. For Jewish men, Passover was a very important time, a very important thing for them, not for young Jewish kids, not for Jewish women, not for Christian men, not for on and on and on. The only way it shows up is here. If it's during the week, then there's about a 7% decrease in death rate in a week before Passover, and goes up right after that. So people wait until Passover is gone before they die. If it's on a weekend, it's not on a religious event, it's a social event. And that makes it even more important. You should see on the left here in a weekend. 25% reduction. Only 76% of the people died that you would expect to die in this particular group. Well, interestingly, they looked around, could they find another group in which there was some special thing, and they found the Chinese Harvest Moon Festival. And I don't know how many of you know about the Chinese Harvest Moon Festival. The Harvest Moon Festival occurs in the fall, as you might expect, and it's the one time of the year that the oldest Chinese woman in the family is the queen. She says, you do this, you young women, you do this. She's the boss lady. And that's her 1 week out of the year when she is really the queen. And what they find is the same kind of results occur. There's a 35% reduction in the death rate in the week before the Harvest Moon Festival, and a 35% increase after the Harvest Moon Festival. What do people die of? Can't control all kinds of death. I should tell you that right now. I'm sorry. Strokes, cerebrovascular diseases, yes. Diseases of the heart, yes. Cancer, yes. Infections and other things, no. Kind of interesting. So the will really works for some kinds of things. The mind can impact the endocrine, the nervous, and the immune system. How does it do it? I surely wish I knew. But I do know one thing. This is the last slide. The human body is a remarkable self-service center. Open 24 hours a day, including weekends. It provides routine maintenance and repair free of charge, with no wait and no hassle. Most of us have no idea what makes us run. Yet our own bodies are our best mechanics. Thank you very much.
Our procedure will be to withhold questions until both commentators have made their presentations. Then we'll offer Dr. Raker an opportunity to respond to them if he so wishes. And then after that, we'll open the floor to the general audience for your questions and comments and discussion.
So all of it, I'll just say to John that, knowledge, in fact, is not just knowledge of where to go in the Middle East or not to go and things like that. But with knowledge comes something that's much more psyche. It's an empowerment. And one of the things, it's an attitude about the world, the belief that the world is a particular way, that it's workable and understandable. And that perhaps more than the absolute knowledge is the critical variable. And I think that's the important thing in terms of the thing that's going on now with the relationship between knowledge and everything. This is one of the reasons why I think people are living so much longer, because they feel so much more comfortable. It's not that you have to worry about what's going to happen because of all these bad things that are going on. The other thing I think that's interesting, and I was taken with your comments, I don't know if you follow the kinds of things, but I'm still amazed at what scientists don't know even in the abstract. You read an article that, guess what, you give a placebo to somebody, and it has an effect in an area of the brain. Well, what the hell do they think it's going to do? Have an effect out there? What can a placebo act? Everything is here. And I don't want to get into whether there's any really out there or not, but because that's for philosophers to do. But I think the critical thing, as Bill was talking about, we need to get down into these mechanisms. See, and I think it's only a matter of time, maybe 100 years, maybe 1,000 years, before we get to the point where, I'll have to stop and I'll go back. I can't, answer either of these two magnificent philosophers with kinds of things. But for example, you watch a small child, and you put a ball out there, and the child will reach for it, and it has to learn to zero in on it. Now this involves things that we know what some of the mechanisms are in the brain. Maybe if we took young children and we knew how to do it, and we could begin to teach them how to use their mind, their thoughts. And that's what for me the mind is, but I'm a simple psychologist, I'm not a, one of the people. We became psychologists because you philosophers were dragging your feet. And so long about, 1879, we said, what the hell, let's go to a lab and get some real data. And so, and
all the fun.
I know it was a fatal mistake, I know. But what's happened now is that we're going back, and now you have someone who was a professor of philosophy and neuroscience, and we begin to realize that maybe these dimensions, as John said, aren't that far apart. We need to begin to bring them back together. And who knows, the Southern Society may become the prominent organization in this kind of cohesiveness between these two different areas. But as soon as you begin to realize that you can't really measure, and I don't believe these people say, well, God resides in this part of the brain or that, but as soon as you begin to realize that you can measure things like a placebo effect, I think maybe you can begin to teach a child some kind of control over what happens in their body that we don't do now. Some of you are familiar with biofeedback techniques. And the reason biofeedback works is because we have some input coming in to tell us what's happening about our body that we can't tell normally. I remember as a graduate student, we used to sit around and wonder at what level could you condition things in the body. And the question really was, could you condition the release of neurotransmitters? When you have a neurotransmitter released from one neuron into the synaptic cleft, could you condition that? And we kind of all agreed that yeah, you could, if you could measure when that happened, and you gave feedback when the green light comes on and says dopamine is being released. Now once you, then you have to learn how to do something to turn that green light on, which is what your biofeedback concept is. I think the same kind of, and then now we know that you can condition the release of dopamine. Because in animals you can monitor, you can get them to increase the amount of dopamine released. See, I think we're going to get more and more control over the mind, the output of the body, the endocrine, the nervous system, the immune system, to our thoughts. And I think our problem now is to, how do we move ahead in this whole thing? But I agree certainly with the comment that Bill made about how, in order to study an area, you've got to go back and understand how the brain works. You've got to go back to Fritz and Hitzig back in the Prussian War, and they're out there on the battlefield looking at these people with brain wounds. One of the great neuropsychologists in the country said there were two great things that advanced brain science in the world: World War II and motorcycles, because they both gave rise to lots of brain injuries. Well, now you don't have to injure the brain, but all the magnificent, imaging that we do now, you may even find out what's going on. And, my heart just goes pretty pat when I read about the imaging studies. And you can study the individuals who are very bright and those who aren't very dull, and you find the very dull use this much of their brain, the very bright use this much of their brain. Well, we need the same kind of thing back when Lashley was doing a study with animals back in 1929. He took animals, and animals are like people. They're bright animals, and they're not so bright animals. You can't call them dumb. They're like that. So these two kinds of animals. What you find now is if you go in and you do cortical lesions in the two groups, guess what? The impact is less on the very bright animals it is on the not so bright animals. I tell my students here at Vanderbilt, they're all bright. I said, that's why when you begin to have these small strokes, have these small kinds of damage to the brain, it's going to impact you less than it is somebody out there who couldn't quite make it through the fifth grade. Because they need more of what they have. You don't need as much of it. Well, you know, it's that kind of a thing, and I'm just kind of talking about things that I think are important because I'd much rather hear questions from other people and not necessarily to me because you've got two other people here with gangbusters. Mike?
Yeah, I just wondered what you can do to determine whether the
I'm sorry, say it again.
what correlates with what. I mean, having more knowledge changes the environment in which you live, right? In various ways. I mean in terms of being in hotels instead of being in a workplace, for example, and living in certain ways. How much you can factor in those environmental changes that come with being more educated as an element in the living longer, as opposed to the knowledge itself. How would you sort that out? Could you?
With great difficulty. One of the things, I used to do animal research, and I got to the point where I had a big lab, and I could have cranked out study after study after study. And I did, and I published them all. But I wasn't ever going to design the wall of science, as I say. I told my students, I said, look, I was somebody who was a bricklayer in the wall of science. I put bricks in the wall. But I didn't design the wall. And if Oakley Ray dropped dead, it's no problem. We kick him aside, they do somebody else in it put bricks in the wall of science. And I reached a point where, that wasn't any fun, because I'm not being a bricklayer. See, and you got to appreciate, I go back to, a very famous story that I use all the time about the fellow who was helping design Westminster Abbey. And he walked around and he was talking to somebody who's down there on his knees, chipping stone. He says, what are you doing, my good man? He says, well, I'm chipping stone. He says, fine. He goes on, finds another person, and he says, what are you doing, my good man? He's doing exactly the same. He says, what are you doing? He says, well, I'm building a wall. Goes on, the third guy, doing exactly the same thing as the first two guys. He says, what are you doing? The guy stands up, smiles, he says, I'm building a cathedral. That's what I want to build cathedrals. See, I got tired of doing all these stupid little studies. I think it's important. See, and I think that's why John doesn't do stupid little studies. He wants to think about the big picture. Now here we have a nice amalgamation. Somebody who does, not stupid, but little studies, maybe studies, trying to get some hard data, put it into the big picture. See, and I can't answer your question. I think maybe Bill could do a better job on that than I can. But that's the hard thing. How do you begin to collect the data and not have people lose sight of the bigger picture? Say one more comment, and I'll bite my tongue and sit down, and I won't answer another question till these two guys have had a chance. My area is kind of brain, drugs, and behavior. And one of the big laments that I have are the people who are looking into the biochemistry of schizophrenia. And they would know a schizophrenic if they walked through the door. That's the kind of thing that I personally am against. The people who, when they're in 10th grade, they begin to zero in on their area of research. And by the time they get through their PhD or their MD, PhD, they know that much about this little. And that's great. And they're going to get a Nobel Prize, more power to them. And I have friends who've got Nobel Prizes for that kind of thing. But to really, people are going to contribute, I think, to the world. The people who know this much. And maybe just love them. Because you can take a whole bunch of these little things, it's back to the old multi non kind of thing. And, a pile of bricks doesn't make a house. It's got to be put together somehow, all the kinds of things that philosophers always talk about. See, that's the critical thing. And I don't know how to do that in all honesty, except to my penny. Because what I try to do is bring these various things together, and somebody's got to begin to bring the data, the mechanisms that are going to make it work. And that doesn't answer your question very well, but I'm going to sit down and let you call for more questions to one of these two other gentlemen.